Good afternoon, everyone. We'll call the meeting to order. We begin with our land acknowledgement statement. We acknowledge that the ground on which we live is the traditional territory of Caldwell First Nation, of the Three Fires Confederacy, and the original people of Point Pelee and Pelee Island, and its surrounding lands and waters, and that of Huron-Wendat and Wyandot peoples. We recognize and respect the First Nations who are stewards of the land and waters of Turtle Island and who have embraced this stewardship since time immemorial. We would also like to acknowledge the contributions of other nearby First Nation communities and all original people across Turtle Island. We can get an adoption of the public planning meeting for June 23rd, 2026. Moved by Councillor Carrick, support by Councillor Richo Spagnolo. All in favor? And that carries. Any disclosures of community interest? There being none. The purpose of the meeting for this evening is the Planning and Development Department of the Town of LaSalle is bringing forward an official plan amendment and zoning bylaw amendment. The purpose of the public meeting is to consider proposed town-initiated amendments to the official plan and zoning bylaw that would permit short-term rentals town-wide subject to specific regulatory provisions. Pursuant to the Planning Act, RSO 1990, CP 13, a notice of public planning meeting dated June 3rd, 2026 was published on the town's website at least 20 days prior to the meeting date, a copy of which is attached here too. Report PD-2026-22 dated June 1st, 2026 contained herein has been prepared to provide the public with pertinent information as to the specifics of the application during the statutory public planning meeting. So I'm going to now turn it over to Ms. Baggs, our Director of Planning and Development.
Thank you, Madam Mayor and members of council. I wanted to take just a quick minute to provide council with some background and context for this town-initiated OPA and ZBA. So if council recalls, in February of this year, we received direction to proceed with a regulatory framework for a short-term rental program, subject to a business plan coming forward at the 2027 budget deliberations. And so that framework contemplated an official plan amendment and a zoning bylaw amendment, which ultimately triggers a statutory meeting under the Planning Act, which is why we're here this afternoon. And so administration deemed it prudent to proceed with that statutory public meeting because it's a necessary requirement under the legislation. But that doesn't mean necessarily that we are advancing with the program. We will only advance the short-term rental regulatory program pending a decision at 2027 budget deliberations, wherein we'll review the business plan that's necessary for the program's implementation. So I just don't want council to think that, we're adopting the program against the guidance that was provided. This is a statutory requirement that we need to fulfill under the legislation. Should council choose not to proceed with the program, we will not adopt the official bylaws associated with the OPA and the ZBA. So I just wanted to provide sort of that overarching guidance for your information. And with that, I will turn it over to our friends at WSP to provide a presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Beggs. Madam Mayor and members of council, it's our pleasure to be here this afternoon with you to talk to you about the short-term rental program for the town of LaSalle. As mentioned, we started this process with an aim to listen to members of council, members of the public, other interested parties to really get an understanding of sort of what's happening on the ground in the town. And through this presentation, we're going to talk to you a little bit about just a sort of a refresher on the process. I'm sure you're all very familiar. But given the statutory nature of this meeting, it's important for us to sort of provide overarching context for those members of the public and other interested parties who haven't been part of the process to date. If I could get the next slide, please. And just as an introduction, I'm Greg Bender from WSP, the sort of project director for this particular project. And we also have Will Lamond, who you've met a couple times before, sort of the project manager and the planning lead for this project. You'll be hearing from both of us, but primarily Will once I go through some of the upfront slides. So this project was undertaken or is being undertaken through sort of 6 tasks, major tasks. As I mentioned, sort of the upfront tasks relate to understanding sort of what's happening in the town as it relates to short-term rentals, any particular issues that people have faced, or what the opportunities might be depending on the interests of those individuals. It's really a background exercise, really upfront, sort of doing that assessment and understanding sort of what the policy framework is in place to sort of enable or provide direction around short-term rentals. The big component of this exercise was to do engagement, which again, we've done engagement with council, members of the public and other interested parties, to listen and sort of be there to have discussions around what people are facing so we can really understand what some of the recommendations could be, and sort of to consider that in the implementing documents, which we're here this afternoon to talk about the official plan amendment and the zoning bylaw amendment, both in draft, no decisions being made, but here for information and discussion. Once we developed the sort of once we understood some of the issues, we developed recommendations for consideration, and sort of provided sort of additional direction around final recommendations and proposed amendments, which we're here to this afternoon to talk about. The next step, as was mentioned, is for council's consideration for adoption, which sounds like it will be in 2027 once a council is sitting at that time. One of the advantages that we have as a sort of a consulting firm is sort of doing this work across the province and in other provinces as well. So we actually hear, quite a lot of issues, and we've been able to develop recommendations in a number of different jurisdictions, but also we use that as sort of a jurisdictional scan. It helps us really understand what other municipalities are doing, sort of the tried, tested, and true. It doesn't mean every option or every recommendation is appropriate for LaSalle, but it's there for information. So we can see what other municipalities have been doing, what have been tested through the tribunal, to understand what might be the most defensible option for the town. We've also identified, so through discussions, a number of issues, a number of gaps that sort of needed to be filled, and some of our recommendations do consider those. Next slide, please. So the work that we've completed through the study, as I mentioned, includes background work, consultation, understanding the options available to try to respond to the information that we've received. That includes how short-term rentals may be permitted. That could mean in allowing short-term rentals where you have a principal resident who's living there full-time versus sort of residents who perhaps don't live there full-time. And I will say quite transparently, for the most part, in every municipality we've done these types of studies, that has been sort of the dividing factor. So we heard that a lot in the consultation that we've held in the town, and certainly our recommendations do consider that. One thing to note, that while we have presented recommendations to council in February of this year, we have continued to keep in mind that additional input is certainly going to be received and should be considered through the whole process. The official plan amendment, the draft official plan amendment and zoning bylaw amendment have considered all the feedback to date, and do sort of fall in line with the discussions that we've had again back in February and before that. What's remaining once council does consider adoption of the implementing documents, the official plan amendment and zoning bylaw amendment, there will be a need to develop a licensing framework, which is really sort of the teeth that allows perhaps short-term rentals that are creating particular issues in a neighborhood that to be required to go through a process to be licensed, versus just having anything new to be sort of subject to any new guidelines. So with that, I'll turn it over to Will, and he can walk through sort of the information that we've heard and how we've considered that through the process in developing the official plan and zoning bylaw amendments.
Thank you, Greg, and good evening. So we can move to the next slide, please. So we'd just like to start with a quick summary of everything that we've heard, and really use this as our sort of launching point for the amendments that are being brought forward for public review today. So the general sort of consensus, overall, that we heard from consultation with the public, from key stakeholders, including tourism experts and in the Windsor-Essex region and members of council, was that there is support for permitting STRs, that there wasn't really support for a total ban on short-term rentals altogether, and that there was an understanding that it was reasonable to permit them. However, that there was a desire to regulate them, and generally support a balance between what we've noted here, which is competition with traditional accommodation. Noting, I know that there isn't a sort of a major hotel industry in the town currently. However, there's other balance too, right? And so there's a few different issues that we spoke to the public about, and that we've heard lots over the course of the study. One of those is the ability for the town to regulate those nuisance issues around noise, parking, property, safety, traffic, and that falls within both the realm of bylaw enforcement and also public safety and police. There's also the housing impact or potential impact from STRs, and so we did hear throughout the study that there is a desire to not have STRs negatively impact housing supply. So that's another balance point that we needed to find. And then we also heard that there can be benefits even for operators of short-term rentals from a regulatory environment that is predictable. There are clear pathways for marketing. We heard from Tourism Windsor Essex that basically having a directory and a list of short-term rentals in various municipalities in the county and in the city of Windsor gives them the opportunity to liaise with those operators and actually advertise them, rather than STRs that are sort of just more under the table. And then finally, the biggest thing we heard, and we heard this very much from council as well when we spoke in February, was that really, in the end, it's about enforcement. And so that's where the licensing framework comes in, and the need to have some, as I think Greg and Director Beggs both said, some teeth. So what we're here today is to really try to set up a framework for the entire environment, so which would be the zoning, official plan, and the licensing, all sort of working in tandem. And so that's what we'll be walking through, is that framework, that sort of baseline that gives the town the foundation on which to build the rest of the framework. Next slide, please. So this framework, it is relatively straightforward, but we've put lots of thought into making sure that this is a custom approach for the town, which is not just sort of a cookie cutter approach from other municipalities, and really does reflect everything that we heard and everything that we learned. So it really comes down to a few key points. One is introducing very clear zoning definitions that address short-term rentals and define them very clearly, but that also addresses bed and breakfasts, which is an existing permitted use in the zoning bylaw and the official plan. The main thrust of the permissions is to permit short-term rentals townwide, but only in those dwelling units where the operator is the principal resident. So not in investment properties, not in secondary properties, only where the person who is advertising and renting out the STR lives in that dwelling unit. And then we wanted to sort of provide enough structure around these permissions with various general provisions in the zoning bylaw that really aligns with a reasonable amount of support for STRs, recognizing that they do exist and that they are serving a function in the town currently, while balancing those impacts that we mentioned in terms of housing supply, as well as potential nuisance effects or other impacts on the community. And then finally, as I noted before, this is the foundation on which the licensing framework can be built. You can do a licensing framework without zoning and official plan. You can do zoning and official plan without a licensing framework for short-term rentals, but it's very rare, and we certainly wouldn't recommend it because, as we've noted, the enforcement really does play such a large part of it. Next slide, please. So first of all is the official plan amendment. So this is really sort of setting the scene for the zoning and making sure that that there's a consistent line of through line between all the sort of the planning direction at the town. So the proposed official plan amendment, it's recommended to replace the existing policies on bed and breakfasts in the OP, which are permitted currently in the residential area and in the rural and agricultural area, and take those policies and replace them with policies for short-term rentals. Apply that principal license requirement. Apply the principal residence requirement and the license requirement, and then as well setting up for both the zoning and the licensing framework and the licensing bylaw by directing that no negative impacts will be occurring on neighbors. And so then, based on the whole concept of townwide permissions, wherever there's a residential use, the designations where STRs would be permitted are the LaSalle Town Center District, the Mixed Use Corridor, Waterfront District, the Residential District, where B&Bs are currently permitted, and the Rural Agricultural District. And then secondly, there is an existing condition in effect OP, which requires a site-specific zoning bylaw amendment prior to the permission for a B&B. And so the proposed OPA would remove that from the official plan, given that there would now be a zoning framework. Next slide, please. So moving into the zoning, so then this would sort of be taking that enabling policy that's in the official plan and really operationalizing it so that, you know, operators and town staff can have a really clear, specific framework to work on. So there would be a new definition added for short-term rental, and then this would, you know, really have the meat of what we've been talking about, which is, you know, defining it as temporary accommodation, so 30 consecutive days or fewer, and requiring that the operator be a principal resident. In addition, the zoning bylaw amendment would redefine bed and breakfast to bring it under short-term rental as essentially a subtype. And it's an STR where sleeping accommodation and meals are provided. And then in addition, there's several new sub-definitions which are only applicable to STRs. So this is where operator, owner, and principal residence would be defined. So those kind of key terms that are nested within the short-term rental definition then have their own clear definitions as well. And then finally, agritourism uses are permitted currently in the zoning bylaw, and they do permit bed and breakfasts. And so there's a slight amendment to make sure that this reflects the change in STR and B&B terminology. So short-term rentals would be permitted as an agritourism use and would be regulated the same way as in anywhere else in the town. Next slide, please. So moving into some of the general provisions to apply to short-term rentals, and this is where the direction from the official plan around making sure that any negative impacts on the neighborhood around the short-term rental are avoided or mitigated. This would apply to wherever a short-term rental is permitted. These provisions would apply. So this, you know, again kind of reiterates the requirement that short-term rentals are only permitted as an accessory use, so they can't be the primary use of a dwelling unit, and that dwelling unit has to be the principal residence of the operator. Only one STR would be permitted per lot for freehold style, and then in apartment style dwellings, one STR per dwelling unit would be permitted. STRs are only permitted in zones where residential units are permitted already, so no new permissions for residential uses would be introduced through this ZBA. STRs wouldn't be permitted in accessory buildings, which aren't actual dwelling units. So if it's an additional residential unit that's in an accessory building, like a backyard garden suite that is fully, plumbed, has a kitchen, has, sanitary and water services, and is being operated as a dwelling unit, the principal resident of that dwelling unit can operate it as an STR. However, if it's a shed, if it's a garage, if it's a boat, an RV, any of these other kinds of structures would not be permitted to be used for STRs. And then STRs must comply with building and fire code requirements. Again, this is just mostly setting up the licensing framework where those requirements can then be inspected and enforced. Basement STRs are addressed as well. So the idea behind this is to prevent situations where there's a short-term rental that is only accessed through another dwelling unit, and that's mostly a safety issue. So basement STRs would be permitted, in a below grade area. However, there needs to be dedicated exterior access directly to that STR. The zoning bylaw will institute the license requirement as well. Again, just sort of yet another setup for the licensing framework. And then finally, the parking requirements would be amended as well. So the parking rates that are in the zoning bylaw for bed and breakfasts would be maintained, which is an additional guest room or additional parking space per guest room, in addition to the required minimum parking for the dwelling unit. And then for STRs, it'd be slightly different. If it's not a bed and breakfast, it would be one additional parking space for the STR, still in addition to the other spaces required for the actual dwelling unit. Next slide, please. So that takes us through the amendments that are before council and the public today. However, we did want to just reiterate our recommendations for future licensing, these are recommendations that were presented at a bit of a higher level before to council, and so we just wanted to bring them back. As your director noted at the beginning, this will be future work that the town will undertake, and WSP is not writing the licensing bylaw, but we do, again, as Greg noted, have the benefit of drawing on quite a lot of work in this matter, and lots of best practices through our jurisdictional scan. So these are what our recommendations would be for the town to consider in the licensing bylaw. So first and foremost, require a license. We apply that requirement to all existing as well as new STRs. So this would be a retroactive requirement. Anybody currently operating a short-term rental would be required to get a license. We think that this is really, there's no way of doing this where you don't bring in all existing STRs. It's the only way of properly regulating. We recommend a 1-year duration. It's pretty typical. Renewal would be contingent, though, on compliance with all the license requirements, and in particular inspections to make sure that STRs are safe, that they meet fire code, health code, building code. Proof would be required that the operator is the principal resident. It's up to the town how that proof is provided and the various types of documentation that might be accepted. But that's a sort of a key part of the framework that we've recommended. If the operator is not the owner, we would recommend that proof of owner consent is provided. This is and basically this is the two-part thing where you want to make sure that the operator is not doing so without knowledge of the owner, and vice versa. You want to make sure that somebody isn't operating their rental unit as an STR and potentially displacing their tenant during those times. Given how precarious housing can sometimes be, we want to make sure that there's no situations where there's any sort of exploitation on either side. We also recommend that licenses be non-transferable. Again, this is pretty much, I would say, across the board is the typical practice for these licensing bylaws. Proof of insurance and maximum occupancy standards would be required as well. And then the final recommendation is that the enforcement be made up of both monetary fines and demerit points. And this is to try to ensure that the cost of, or that fines don't become just the cost of doing business for an operator, and that there is a pathway where, operators who continue to flout the licensing framework eventually lose their license. Okay. That takes us to the end of the presentation on the amendments and our recommendations for the future. So we'd be happy to take questions from council, or we'll leave it in your hands to direct us here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any comments from administration before I go ahead?
Thank you and good evening, Madam Mayor, members of council. I'd just like to add on top of, well, first of all, thank you, Will and Greg, for the presentation and all your help through this project. I just want to also add that, as mentioned, this was publicized as a public planning meeting. Public notice was posted on the town's website in accordance with the Planning Act. And I just want to add that to date, we have not heard any comments or any written correspondence on the matter. Other than what was presented, I have nothing further to add, but I am available for questions if there are any. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Members of council. Councillor Carrick?
Just a couple quick ones. So we're looking at basically across town, so I understand this correctly, so that little pockets won't be left out. Okay, that's good. And then secondly, the cost for licensing, I know we're not doing anything today except moving it forward, but yearly renewal, now, there would be a yearly cost every time you come to renew your license, there would be a cost added to that? And would that be substantial? Would it be enough to cover our cost to hand out the license or to renew the license? That's that helps, goes a long way.
Yeah, so I think through you, we'll definitely have to look at all of that when we come back with a licensing bylaw for council consideration. But all of those factors that you cited will definitely be part of our analysis and research.
Thank you, Your Worship.
Councillor Reno?
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you, gentlemen, for reminding us of all the steps that we've gone through in the last year or so. Ironically, I was at an STR today, a very someone today. So when I spoke to the neighbors, and they all came out their doors to talk to me when they saw me, the steps that you're taking and the steps that we're looking to put into place are all very well appreciated, especially the owner operator occupancy. Many can recognize that will take some of the foolishness out of some of these STRs, because they're not all bad, but there are a few that fly under the radar. I did have, so my question was, I was able to go to your open house at the Balmer, and I got to hear a lot of the comments, and a lot of the comments have made it into council chambers as well. I'm just wondering, of all the people that you spoke to, how many owner operators did you actually speak to? Are they understanding, appreciative, or have they spoken and chimed in at all? I'm just wondering how that population has been represented in this process.
Through the mayor, councillor. Yeah, I would say generally it's been not a lot that we've heard in terms of feedback directly from operators. I know I did have a chance to talk to at the open house. There were a couple folks who were either interested in getting into it or sort of operating rental properties already and were sort of eyeing it. And generally, I think from my recollection and from our notes, I think it was generally there was an understanding of it. I certainly didn't hear any like direct sort of pushback against it. Maybe Greg, if you want to speak to this, I know that you were. Yeah.
So just to continue what Will was talking about and through the mayor to Councillor Reno. You get a cross section of individuals, and I'm not suggesting this is a significant cross section. I think it was about 3 or 4 people who some appreciate that there's a framework needed to guide short-term rentals, and the town is going through this to ensure that there's a level playing field, the standard that's being established. There are some that think that it's maybe a bit onerous, but kind of get it. And then there's 1 or 2 individuals that I spoke to that said, to summarize, it's my property. Why can't I do what I want on it? And I think you're going to get that in any planning process. And part of the work that we have to do is establishing what's best and defensible based on the work that we've done, based on our recommendations as professional planners. So we, in every single process, hear everything from one side to the other and everything in the middle. And we have to do what's best we feel for the town and again, something that's defensible. So I think that what we've recommended is based on sort of the information that we've heard, again, and what's best for the town. We could take this even further if we wanted to, but we haven't heard the kind of feedback that we've thought that might be required. So as Will mentioned, it's fairly straightforward. I can tell you in the majority of the short-term rental projects we've done, we've taken it a lot further because of the feedback that we've received. So we've tried to make sure we just, we targeted sort of the feedback that we heard and provided recommendations around something that's reasonable and not something that's going to, be a significant amount of work and require a web of things to go through on a annual basis.
Thank you.
Councillor Segan?
Thank you, through you, Mayor Malash. First of all, I am quite pleased to see that there is a strong effort to approach it from a licensing perspective and something that can be monitored on an annual basis. But it's not just the neighbors who right now are dealing with these issues, which is important because that's why we're here today. But I also look at it from the perspective that these are run in a safe manner. So in other words, fire codes, et cetera, health codes, so that the people that use these in our town can feel comfortable and appreciate the fact that they are going to be in a place that's been monitored and following regulations that are necessary for that. So I appreciate that you entered that into this conversation. Thank you.
Deputy Mayor?
Thank you, Worship. Through you to anyone. My mind always goes to deviance because that's my background as a copper. So I'm trying to figure out how you're going to define, if I'm lucky enough to own multiple properties in town, and I tell you that X, Y, or Z is my primary residence, how are you going to confirm it? I know that even Revenue Canada has a hard time doing it because I've previously investigated some cases where people have shenaniganly separated and on paper so they could sell their cottage and not pay levels of tax. So I'm just wondering, as we start to move forward, how will we determine that?
We're open to ideas. It is something that we've also grappled with internally. We've talked about that very concept of, being able to substantiate proof that it is in fact their principal residence. It's tricky. I believe Mr. Sassine has some thoughts on the matter. I don't know if you're willing to share some of your ideas related to incorporating that into the licensing bylaw. But again, those ideas will all be flushed out as part of a future bylaw. But right now we're in sort of an information gathering exercise related to how we're going to manage this.
Thank you. Through your Mayor Malash to the Deputy Mayor. There's a variety of ways that we're going to go about it, hopefully. One is obviously the information that we receive from the applicant. So any type of driver's license hopefully will be reflective of their primary residence, which is required. There are instances where people do own multiple properties in town, or they may have a mailing address where they mail things for a particular reason and not necessarily reside there. So it is going to fall on my department to ensure that those people are in fact, that is their primary residence. That's going to require obviously the resources to investigate that, to identify those who aren't. But there's also other issues that arise because of this with, the number of days that they rented out to ensure that they're not exceeding the allotted amount of days that they're permitted to rent out the dwelling in a calendar year. So it's going to be a lot of old-fashioned police work. It's going to be one of those ones where on the ground and it's going to be on site and monitoring. It's going to be continually monitoring it. So there is going to be a lot of old-fashioned work that's going to go into it. Technology can only take us so far. And after that, it's going to be just a matter of grunt work.
Thank you to either of the gentlemen through you, and a supplemental disclosure of information. Looking at the charter and looking at the rights that people have, how do we go about what our folks have talked about? Again, if it's not appropriate now, I'm just thinking about this because as I start to think about this, I'm already starting to think about ways to make it difficult because that's my job, so I can share with you what I would do. So I'm just looking at your experience in other communities, asking for that information, demanding it, requiring it. Wow. If I lived in Toronto, which I wouldn't, but if I did, I know exactly where I'd live and I wouldn't drive. I wouldn't have a driver's license because I'd be a TTC person. So I'm just trying to think about the things that Mr. Sassine has talked about, the investigatory part as it gets to mandatory disclosure of private information to the municipality outside the information that we collect. Because you've got all my tax information. I've got 7 houses in the town. My taxes are up to date. My lawns are immaculate. I'm just trying to make sure that I understand so that as we move forward, that we don't find ourselves in a bind. And if you gentlemen can comment on what you've provided to other municipalities, if that's appropriate, I really like to understand the level we're going to have to go through to make sure that it's a seamless transition from where we are to where we want to go.
And through the mayor to the councillor, it's a very good question. I recall you asking also a question similar back in November, I think, when we met. Typically, what we would do is work with administration, whether that be Town of LaSalle or another municipality, to lean on your legal counsel to provide some feedback on that. Us as lowly planners who sort of work under the Planning Act, we only have so many things we can do. I think a lot of the information that you're talking about is under other pieces of legislation that would be outside of our expertise. But the best thing I could offer, which is just to echo what your director was saying, is that jurisdictional scans, speaking to other colleagues across municipalities in Essex County or abroad. We've worked in some municipalities that have the most short-term rentals across the country, and the best conversation would be to speak to them. I would agree with you. There's only so much that you can do to provide information around principal residency and things of that sort. But I mean, other municipalities are well along sort of the road in terms of their processes. So I would start with that.
Thank you, Your Worship.
Councillor Burns?
So what you're presenting to us is a short-term rental with somebody in the home. Well, a few years ago I went to the Grey Cup, and I brought this up before, and I'm going to bring it up again because I don't want you in a home when I'm bringing my family to a weekend. So it could be the Grand Prix in Windsor or in Detroit. It could be a soccer game there. All I did was call their 1-800 number, give them my card. We had 3 cars on the property. There was enough room to sleep 15 in this house. There was nothing wrong in a neighborhood. And whether you like it or I like it, that's going to happen in our smaller homes in LaSalle. I mean, if I'm going to rent a home out short term, I'm going to rent it out on that basis. I'm not renting it out, and they can be rented out here like we have had the bridge program for years, and people are renting homes out, short-term rentals for 5 years, and we don't regulate those. So how do you address that? And my other question is fine to do all this stuff, but I guess when the rubber meets the road is, what is it going to cost us, and what's the benefit to the town other than we know where they're at? We don't know where they're at now. There's 1 or 2 issues. I mean, I see, instead of bylaw going out there and giving them a ticket or whatever, I see a police officer at 9 o'clock at night, because I'm not calling in bylaw officer A to go out there to write a $100 ticket, and it's going to cost me 4 hours more than the ticket. So is in any of your experiences, do you have police officers or auxiliary members of a police service that have the ability to write those tickets and would be working rather than calling in somebody on overtime? Thank you.
Ms. Beggs, do you want to answer some of that?
Sorry, yeah. Through you, Councillor Burns, I think a lot of what you're focusing on will be fleshed out as part of a licensing bylaw, as it relates to penalties and requirements under the licensing, and making sure that the program has the capacity, if it does, to fund itself. Greg and Will are land use planners by trade, so they deal with policy documents, official plans, and zoning bylaws. They're not necessarily going to be able to help support us on what our licensing bylaw should look like. And hopefully we'll have some additional criteria and restrictions related to that when we present a business plan to council as part of budget deliberations.
Follow up. who's going to write the draft bylaw amendment? These gentlemen? Or are we hiring another third party to do that?
Through you. So with WSP's support, they helped us to prepare the framework for the official plan amendment bylaw and the zoning bylaw amendment. Our internal team has prepared those documents. So when we get council direction to implement the program, we will come back to council for formal adoption of those documents internally. As it relates to the regulatory bylaw, that will be done in-house as well.
Follow up. Then I hope there's a business plan to say, here's the bylaw, here's the cost. Because that's going to drive my motivation. I mean, if I see at the end of the day that I am spending $300,000 to take in $50, it makes no sense to regulate. Because if we're not going to enforce it and have enough revenue in to pretty near cover all the costs, then it certainly in the future, if I'm here, would make my decision very easy to make. And it's kind of similar to what we do with other projects, whether it's planning, for a subdivision, there's a certain amount of money comes in to support what we need to do going forward. And that may change, but that would be a thing.
So you're aware, in the recommendations today, the second one actually does state that it will follow approval of a business plan. So we are getting a business plan coming back, but if we could maybe focus on the first part of your question, because I think that's the only thing that these gentlemen may be able to address, which is the owner-occupied STR. So I don't know if you want any answer on that part, but the rest of it will come back to us before we move forward with anything. I don't know if there's anything you can add on that type of STR.
Certainly, through the mayor, to respond to your question on the owner occupied, Councillor Burns, the way that it's set up is that the operator of the SDR has to be the principal resident. It does not require them to be present during the rental of the unit. If it's a bed and breakfast kind of style thing where they are welcoming people in and providing meals, but it can also be what really was the sort of original pitch of Airbnb and Vrbo and a lot of these platforms, which was, hey, you're going out of town for 3 months. While you're gone, rent out your place over, the course of the 3 months to various people coming in for, 30 days or less. So it's that idea. So it doesn't necessarily mean, and I think it is a worthwhile question if you're considering how, the framework serves accommodation needs in the town, which is I think for the council, I think what you're asking is this going to potentially turn away people from actually wanting to rent SDRs here? So the answer is that scenario you described where you rent out a whole house and the owner isn't there while you're there, that is still totally possible under this framework.
Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I wanted to answer the question myself because that was something I considered, as well as when we hear about STRs, usually it's someone has a home that they live in and has purchased another home and they rent out that second home. And that's what I was wondering by the wording, if that prohibits that. Because we want some STRs, but we want to be able to control STRs, but we also acknowledge there's a housing crisis. So, I mean, it's a tough thing to balance right now, both of those scenarios. But I did appreciate his comment about that because I was trying to understand it as well. Councillor Carrick?
I'm going to be willing to make the motion. I just want to say one comment. The reason we're here is because residents are complaining about people renting places all over the place throughout town that are uncontrolled. So that's why we're actually here to start the process. So I don't think we need to lose that fact. We just need to stay focused. But if nobody else has any comments, I would make the motion for number 2.
Okay, before we do that, Councillor Regis-Pagnola, did you have?
Thank you, through you. Just mainly my main concern was just obviously enforcing with the demerit points and the penalties. With only having the one bylaw officer, obviously that's something that would have to be brought up in budgets. That was really my main concern. A couple other things that I believe Councillor Reno alluded to. And then that was it. Just, obviously, that was my main concern. With only one bylaw officer, how are we going to be implementing this enforcement? And that was it. And thank you for the presentation.
Thank you. Any other questions? I do have one comment, one question. I do really appreciate the point where you said that we're prohibiting 3-in-1s or 2-in-1 units, because I think that's where we're actually seeing more of the issue is people creating 2 or 3 rental units in one home, which brings me to the second part, which is parking. So in there, you mentioned that they would need an additional parking space on top of what is already required. So how does that work in an established neighborhood? Are we talking about a spot on a road? How do we get that extra spot?
Through you, Mayor Meloche, the parking thing is an interesting question. We've wrestled with this and with other studies as well. If you look at a lot of typical newer development subdivisions, often the parking is, it'll be a minimum of 2 spaces for a single detached house. Sometimes there isn't any more space than that. I think probably it may be a bit of a cooling effect on some STRs, but the trade-off is that this is the only way of the town really avoiding, street parking issues, which were identified by many members of the public that we spoke to, of the sort of overflow of parking, is to sort of, you say if it's a 3-bedroom single detached house that's being operated as a short-term rental, and to Councillor Burns' point about a couple families renting it out, you're probably looking at more than the typical 2 cars that have a space there, hence the need to require another space. So it's a bit of a balance. There may be some properties that can't meet off-street parking requirements at that level, and that is just one of the sort of trade-offs of protecting for the parking. Greg, I don't know if you had any other thoughts here.
And thanks, Will, and thank you, Mayor Meloche, for the question. It's I would say a consistent piece of feedback we've heard in almost every study that we've done is parking, and a lot of the individuals in particular neighborhoods don't want to see hordes of parking on street. I know from many municipalities' standpoint, they don't want to see that either, because it can impact the ability to maintain access at all times for emergency vehicles, depending on the time of year, cleaning of streets, plowing, things of that sort. So part of one of the requirements is off-street parking. So if they can't demonstrate that, then perhaps the STR can't be accommodated.
Thank you. I appreciate that. We do have a mover with the second recommendation, which is if all issues are resolved at the public planning meeting, the requisite official plan amendment and zoning bylaw amendment and associated bylaws will be brought forward for council's consideration at a subsequent council meeting following approval of the business plan for the implementation of the short-term rental program. And that was moved by Councillor Carrick and support by Councillor Richo Spagnuolo. All in favor? And that carries. Thank you very much for joining us. I appreciate your time, and meeting adjourned.